I was in the middle of heart surgery when my daughter started selling my jewelry on social media. I woke up, called my lawyer, and removed her from the will before the anesthesia even wore off. The first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was a ceiling tile with a hairline crack running diagonally across its left corner. The second thing I saw was the face of my nurse, a broad-shouldered woman with kind eyes and the practiced calm of someone who has watched people return from the edge of consciousness enough times that the moment no longer startles her. The third thing I saw was my phone, which my nurse was holding at arm's length with an expression on her face that I would later come to understand was not confusion but deliberate restraint. The expression of a professional who has decided that what she is looking at is not her business but who has also decided, for reasons of her own, that I should see it. I did not know yet how long I had been under. I did not know yet that it had been 6 hours and 14 minutes. I did not know that the surgeon, a meticulous man named Dr. Okafor who had performed this particular procedure 411 times, had been satisfied with the outcome and had noted in his post-operative report that for a 69-year-old woman, my heart was in considerably better structural condition than he had anticipated. I did not know any of that. What I knew in those first blurred and cotton-edged seconds of consciousness was that I was alive, that something had been repaired inside my chest that had needed repairing, and that my nurse was holding my phone with an expression that meant something was wrong. I reached for it. My arm was heavy. There was a cannula in the back of my hand and a blood pressure cuff on my upper arm, and the particular full-body stiffness of a person who has been still for a long time. I reached for it anyway. Because I am not a woman who waits for things to be brought to her when she can reach for them herself. She let me take it. I looked at the screen. My daughter had been busy. My name is Dorothea Marsh. I am 69 years old, and for 37 years I ran a specialist antique textile business from a long, narrow shop on a cobbled street in a city that rewards patience and precision, and has no use for people who cannot tell the difference between genuine 18th century needlework and a competent reproduction. I started with $1,200, a rented space the size of a generous closet, and a knowledge of historical textiles that I had spent the better part of my 20s acquiring at considerable personal cost, through study and travel and the kind of obsessive attention to detail that other people find exhausting and that I find simply necessary. My mother had been a seamstress. Her mother before her had embroidered for a living, in the old country, in conditions I prefer not to dwell on. I had grown up with fabric between my fingers and an understanding of thread count and weave structure that was not taught so much as absorbed, the way you absorb language when you grow up inside it. By the time my daughter Renata was born, I had the shop and I had a reputation, which in my business is worth more than capital. By the time she started school, I had expanded into a second room and taken on a part-time assistant. By the time she finished school I had 3 employees, a mailing list of collectors in 9 countries, and a sideline in private appraisals that took me to estate sales in private homes and, on 3 occasions, to the back rooms of museums where curators wanted a second opinion on something they were not yet ready to make public. I also had, by that time, a collection. This is important to understand because the collection is central to everything that followed. Over 37 years I had assembled piece by piece a personal collection of jewelry that was partly an investment, partly a professional tool, and partly, if I am honest, a love affair. Not costume jewelry. Not fashion jewelry. Antique pieces, most of them with documented provenance, acquired through decades of careful attention at auctions and estate sales, and the occasional private transaction with a collector who trusted my knowledge and my discretion. A Georgian mourning brooch with original hairwork. A Victorian garnet parure, nearly complete. A set of Edwardian enamel and pearl hairpins still in their original fitted case. A mid-19th century gold locket with a portrait miniature inside that I had bought from a descending estate in the north of England and which I had subsequently traced, through months of archival work, to a specific woman in a specific town in a specific year. A woman I felt, irrationally but persistently, that I knew. There were 41 pieces in total. I kept them in a fireproof cabinet in the back room of my shop, each one catalogued, photographed, insured, and known to me with the intimacy of objects that have been handled and studied and loved over years. They were mine. They were not for sale. I had been asked about them many times by collectors who knew of their existence, and my answer was always the same. When I died, they would go to the City Museum's decorative arts collection, along with the documentation I had compiled over decades. That was in my will, written clearly and witnessed properly, Updated 3 years ago when I had added a small codicil covering 2 new acquisitions. Renata knew this. She had known it for years. I had given Renata a great deal over the course of her life, and I want to be accurate about it in the way that I am always accurate about things that matter. Her education, primary and secondary, at schools I chose carefully and paid for without complaint, $31,000 over 12 years, in a time when that represented a significant portion of what the shop produced. Her gap year at 19, which she spent traveling through 3 continents in a manner she described as self-discovery, and which I did not interrogate too closely because I had also been young and also needed, at that age, to be somewhere other than where I had started. $7,000, released to her in installments against receipts that she sent me with variable regularity. Her university fees, 3 years studying art history, which I approved of because it was in the right direction and disapproved of in the way she approached it, which was casually, as though the information would absorb itself without effort on her part, $22,000. Her first proper apartment at 23, when the shared house she had been living in had become, by her account, untenable, and the apartment she wanted was beyond her salary. 8 months of supplementary rent, $600 a month, $4,800. A loan of $15,000 at 26, when she had decided to open a small vintage clothing shop and needed startup capital. We had drawn up a repayment agreement. She had repaid $4,000 of it before the shop closed, 18 months later. I had written off the remaining $11,000 without making it a prolonged discussion. A contribution of $12,000 to her wedding at 31, to a man named Sebastian whom I had regarded with cautious optimism and who had, in the years since, neither confirmed nor dispelled that optimism, occupying a kind of permanent neutral territory in my estimation. He was not unkind. He was not particularly present. He worked in sales and traveled a great deal and seemed genuinely surprised when things required his active participation. Various other amounts at various other times, for various other purposes that I had been persuaded on each occasion, constituted genuine need rather than convenience. Car repairs, a medical bill that insurance had not covered, a deposit on a new apartment when she and Sebastian had moved cities, a semester of additional study she had undertaken and not completed. I stopped keeping a running total around the time she turned 34 because the running total had begun to produce an emotion I did not want to have. She was now 38 years old. She had a son, my grandson Felix, who was 6, and who was the clearest and most uncomplicated joy in my life, a child of extreme curiosity and absolute fearlessness and a 3-minute attention span that I found in grandchildren entirely charming. She also had what I had come to understand in the months before my surgery, was a significant financial problem that she had not told me about and that I had pieced together through a series of small observations. A comment about Sebastian's commissions being down, a mention of credit card interest that she dropped and then retrieved too quickly, a particular tone in her voice when money came up in conversation that I recognized because I had heard it before, in the years when the shop was struggling, in my own voice, in my own mirror. I had not pushed. I had decided to wait until she came to me, because I was 69 and I had learned that pushing produced defensiveness and defensiveness produced distance and distance helped no one. I had not anticipated that the surgery would come first. The surgery had been scheduled for 8 weeks. My cardiologist, a thorough woman named Dr. Prentice who communicated in precise percentages and did not soften things unnecessarily, had identified a structural issue with one of my heart valves 18 months earlier, and had monitored it with the patience of someone watching a slow tide. When the tide reached the point she had identified as actionable, she told me so, and we scheduled the procedure. And I spent the following 8 weeks arranging things. I arranged the shop. I arranged my affairs. I arranged for my assistant, a capable 44-year-old woman named Cecily who had worked with me for 11 years, to manage operations in my absence. I arranged for my neighbor to collect my mail. I arranged for my friend Lawrence, who had been my solicitor for 23 years and who was one of the most methodical human beings I had ever encountered, to have an updated copy of my will and power of attorney. I told Renata I was having the surgery. She came to see me the week before with Felix, and she hugged me at the door in a way that lasted a fraction longer than her hugs usually lasted, which I noted and which I found in that moment sufficient. I went into the hospital on a Tuesday morning. I was prepared. I was not frightened, or rather I was frightened in a manageable way, which is the only way I know how to be frightened. They administered the anesthesia at 8:41 in the morning. At 8:41 in the morning plus some number of hours that I was not conscious to measure, my daughter drove to my shop. Cecily was there. This was noted in the account Cecily gave me afterward, in full without omission, because Cecily had worked with me for 11 years and knew where her loyalty resided. Renata arrived at 10:20 in the morning. She told Cecily she needed to access the back room because she was collecting something on my behalf. She had a key. I had given her a key to the shop years ago, in the way that you give family members keys to things you trust them with, which is to say not because you have weighed the risk carefully but because they are family and the gesture feels like the right kind of open. Cecily had asked reasonably what she was collecting. Renata had said she needed a few pieces from the cabinet. Cecily had said she wasn't sure that was something she could authorize without hearing from me directly. Renata had pointed out correctly that I was currently in surgery. Cecily had said she understood that and she was sorry but she wasn't comfortable. Renata had said she was my daughter and she had a key. Cecily had said yes and she was very sorry but she still wasn't comfortable. They had stood in that impasse for a few minutes. Then Renata had gone into the back room with her key and her determination, and Cecily, who was not in a position to physically prevent her and who was also, to her credit, already reaching for her own phone, had watched her open the cabinet. Renata had taken 9 pieces. Not all 41. 9. I want to note that because it is somehow more precise in its wrongness than taking all of them would have been. She had selected 9. She had chosen. She had stood at that cabinet, which she had seen me open and close for her entire life, and she had picked up each piece and looked at it and decided, for each one, whether it was worth taking. The Georgian mourning brooch, the Victorian garnet parure, 4 of the Edwardian hairpins, the gold locket with the portrait miniature, and a small late 18th century enamel ring that I had bought from an elderly collector in the south of France, and that had no particular monetary value but that I had kept because I loved it. She had put them in her bag. She had driven home. By early afternoon, she had photographed each piece and posted it for sale on a resale platform, with descriptions she had copied imperfectly from the insurance documentation, which told me she had either found my files or, more likely, had been in those files before. She had priced the garnet parure at $4,000. The locket, which was worth considerably more, she had listed for $1,800, because she did not know what she had. The mourning brooch she had listed for $350, which was an insult of a figure that told me she had looked it up hastily online and found the wrong reference point entirely. The total asking price for 9 pieces with a combined insured value of $63,000 was approximately $14,000. That was the screen my nurse held at arm's length. Cecily had sent me screenshots, 15 of them, with a message that said only, "I am so sorry. I tried to stop her. Please call me when you can." I have been asked since how I felt in that moment. People expect, I think, the answer to involve devastation. A specific kind of grief that is about betrayal rather than loss, the grief of recognizing something in a person you love that you cannot unknow. What I actually felt, lying in a hospital bed with a cannula in my hand and the residue of anesthesia in my blood and a pressure in my chest that was the surgery and not emotion, was a very particular kind of clarity. The clarity of a woman who has been given, finally and without ambiguity, the information she needed. I had known for some time that something was wrong with Renata's finances. I had known for longer that something was wrong in the territory between us, some slow erosion of honesty that I had been unable to name and had been unwilling to confront. This was the name. Here it was in 15 screenshots on a resale platform, 9 objects that had been in my family for decades photographed on what appeared to be my daughter's kitchen table with a price tag attached. I did not feel devastated. I felt the particular coldness of a decision that has been made for you by someone else's action, the relief almost of no longer having to weigh it. I pressed the call button beside my bed. My nurse appeared. I told her I needed my phone fully charged, a glass of water and some privacy. She looked at me for a moment with the assessing gaze of a medical professional measuring whether a patient is stable enough for what they are about to do. And then she nodded and brought me the charging cable and the water and pulled the curtain. I called Lawrence. He answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Dorothea, you're awake." I said, "Yes." He said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Functional." "Lawrence, I need you to listen." He listened. I told him about the 9 pieces. I told him about the resale listings. I told him to pull up the platform. I gave him the name, and to look at the listings under a seller name he would find, which was a variation of Renata's name that she had apparently been using for some time, because the account had other items on it, items I did not recognize but which Lawrence, looking confirmed, appeared to include several objects of the kind that a woman with a mother in the antique jewelry business might have access to over the years. There was a silence. Lawrence, in 23 years, had heard a great deal from me. He was not easily surprised. The silence was brief. He said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He said, "You're certain?" I said, "Lawrence." He said, "Right. I'll start now." I said, "Call me when it's done." I put the phone down. I drank the water. I looked at the ceiling tile with the hairline crack in its left corner, which had become, over the past half hour, oddly familiar to me in the way that objects become familiar when they are the fixed point in an otherwise uncertain landscape. My chest ached. The surgery ached. Everything ached in the specific way of a body that has been opened and repaired, and is now communicating the full extent of what that involved. I closed my eyes and waited. By the time the ward settled into its mid-afternoon quiet, Lawrence had begun. By 3 p.m. he had pulled my current will from his files, where it had lived since I last updated it 3 years ago, and had begun the amendment process. The will was not complicated in its structure, though it was thorough in its detail. The estate I had built over 37 years, the shop, its inventory, the personal collection, the property, the investment accounts, had been organized carefully, because I had always organized things carefully, and because Lawrence had insisted on it, and because I trusted Lawrence's insistence. Renata had been named as primary beneficiary, with specific bequests for Felix held in trust until his 25th birthday administered by Lawrence. By 4 p.m., Lawrence had drafted the amendment removing Renata as primary beneficiary across all instruments. The specific bequests for Felix were separated out and remained intact, held in the trust structure, because Felix was 6 years old and had not taken anything from anyone's cabinet, and I did not punish children for their parents' decisions. By 5 p.m., Lawrence had contacted my insurance company to report the 9 missing pieces as taken without authorization. This was important, and Lawrence had understood immediately why it was important. Not primarily for the insurance claim, though the insurance claim would follow, but for the documentation. A report created a record. A record was a fact. Facts were useful. By 6 p.m. the shop had been contacted. Cecily had already changed the access code on the backroom cabinet, operating on instinct, and Lawrence confirmed this was correct. Renata's key was noted as outstanding, and the lock on the shop's rear entrance was scheduled for replacement first thing the following morning. By 7 p.m., Lawrence had reached a colleague who handled civil recovery matters and had outlined the situation. The 9 pieces were still listed online. Several had not yet sold. 2 had been marked as sold, which meant they were already gone or shortly would be. The solicitor confirmed that the circumstances, the pieces taken from a business premises while the owner was undergoing surgery, listed for sale without authorization, were clear enough in their nature that the civil recovery position was strong. By 8 p.m. Lawrence called me at the hospital. I was still awake because I sleep badly in hospitals, because the sounds are wrong and the light is wrong, and because I had too much to think about to surrender consciousness willingly. He told me the amendment was drafted and ready for my signature, which would be executed as soon as I was able. He told me about the insurance report. He told me about the recovery solicitor. He told me about the shop. He told me that Cecily had sent him her written account of the afternoon, time-stamped and detailed, which he had received and filed. I asked if there was anything else. He said there was one more thing. He said that in looking at the resale account, he had found 43 other listings over the preceding 8 months, items that appeared, from their descriptions and photographs, to be objects that could have come from my shop's inventory or from my personal collection or from my home. Items I had not noticed missing, which was possible. I had a great deal, and also possibly because they had been taken gradually, carefully, in a way designed not to be noticed. I said, 43. Lawrence said, yes. I lay in my hospital bed in the ward that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and I thought about 8 months. About the visits Renata had made over those months, the dinners, the time she had been at the shop on one pretext or another, the time she had been in my house with or without Felix while I was in another room. 8 months of gradual, careful patient-taking. I thought about Sebastian, who traveled a great deal for work. I thought about the financial problem I had sensed and not pushed. I thought about Felix, who was 6 and who had my mother's eyes. I said, "Lawrence." He said, "Yes." I said, "Make sure Felix's trust is airtight." He said, "Already done." I said, "Good night." He said, "Good night, Dorothea. Rest." I did not rest, not truly, but I lay in the dark and I was still, and that was enough. 6 months is sufficient time to understand what has happened. Renata did not call me the morning after I came home from the hospital. She did not call me the day after that. She called me on the 4th day, and by then Lawrence had sent her the formal notification of the will amendment, which she had received that morning, and the call was not, therefore, a call to ask after my health. She was not screaming. I want to be accurate about that too. She was very quiet, which was, in some ways, harder to listen to than screaming would have been. She asked if it was true. I said it was. She asked why. I said I thought she knew why. There was a silence. She said the items she had sold were not significant pieces. She said she had needed the money urgently and she had panicked and she had thought, this is the word she used, thought, as though thought had been involved. She thought I would understand when she explained it. I asked why she had not called me before taking anything. She said I was in surgery. I said I had been in surgery for 6 hours. The pieces had been taken in the morning and listed by early afternoon. I asked her when, in that timeline, she had planned to tell me. There was another silence. She said things had gotten very bad with the money. She said Sebastian's commissions had been down for 1.5 years. She said there were debts I did not know about. She said she had been afraid to tell me because she thought I would be disappointed in her. I said that I was, in fact, disappointed in her. She said, "Mom." I said, "Renata, you took things from my shop while I was on an operating table. You did not take them because you had no other option. You took them because you had decided on some level that they were available to you. That my things were your things. That what I have built is something you have claim to." I paused. "You do not." She said she was sorry. I said I heard that. She said she wanted to make it right. I said I knew she meant that, in the moment she was saying it. I told her that the 9 pieces had been reported to my insurance company and to a civil recovery solicitor, and that the 2 that had sold would need to be accounted for, and that Lawrence would be in touch with her regarding the process. I told her that this was not something I was doing to punish her. I told her it was something I was doing because the alternative was to absorb the cost and the violation quietly, and I was 69 years old and I had had surgery on my heart 4 days ago and I was no longer able to absorb things quietly. She was crying by then. I listened to her cry for a moment, because she was still my daughter, and I was not made of the material that allows a mother to be entirely unmoved by her child's tears. Then I said, "Felix can visit on Sunday. I will send a car." She said, "Mom, please." I said, "Sunday. 2 o'clock. I'll have lunch." I ended the call. This is where the daughter of a different kind of mother would be, 6 months later. Renata was in a 2-bedroom apartment she had moved into after she and Sebastian separated, which they did, quietly and without apparent drama, approximately 10 weeks after my surgery. The apartment was in a neighborhood I did not know well, mid-range, perfectly acceptable, the kind of neighborhood that a person lands in when they are beginning again rather than continuing. She had taken a full-time position at an auction house, in their textiles and decorative arts department, which was an area she knew from proximity if not from formal training, and which paid her a salary that was modest but honest. She was, by Cecily's account, Cecily had seen her once at a professional event, working hard, looking well, thinner than she had been, in the way people are thinner when stress is no longer being managed with convenience. Sebastian had an apartment of his own. Felix moved between them in the way that 6-year-olds move between separated parents, with a resilience that is both reassuring and a little heartbreaking. Felix came to me on Sundays. He had come every Sunday without exception for 6 months. He arrived with the energy of a small natural disaster and spent the first 20 minutes of each visit telling me, at considerable speed, everything that had happened to him in the preceding week. He ate large quantities of the food I prepared for him. He had developed a passionate interest in how locks worked, which I was encouraging, and in a series of illustrated books about deep-sea creatures, which I found genuinely interesting myself. 2 pieces of the 9 had been recovered. The civil recovery process was ongoing. The insurance claim was settled for the pieces that could not be recovered. The 43 other items from the resale account were being assessed individually. Some had been confirmed as mine, some had not, and Lawrence was working through it with patience and his customary absence of drama. Renata had made no claim on the estate. She had not asked again about the will. She had, in the 6 months since the phone call, sent me 3 letters. Handwritten. Not asking for anything. The first had been an apology, measured and specific, that named each piece she had taken and acknowledged what each one had meant to me, which told me she knew my collection better than I had realized. The second had been about Felix, what he was doing at school, a thing he had said that had made her laugh, a small update offered without request. The third had been about the auction house, a piece they had brought in that she had found unexpectedly moving, a silk panel from the early 19th century that she had held in her hands and thought, she wrote, about the person who had made it. She had not asked me to respond. I had not yet responded. I was not yet ready. But I had kept all 3 letters in the drawer of the table beside my reading chair, which is not where I keep things I have finished with. My chest was fully healed. Dr. Okafor had confirmed this at my 3-month follow-up with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman reviewing completed work, and again at my 6-month review with something approaching warmth, which for Dr. Okafor constituted effusiveness. He told me my heart was in better condition than it had been in several years. He told me to continue the medication and the walking program. He told me to avoid prolonged stress, which he said with a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that suggested he knew, somehow, that the preceding 6 months had not been without incident. I walked every morning. Not far and not fast, because Dr. Okafor had been specific about not far and not fast, but out and along the streets I had lived among for 31 years, past the baker who nodded at me through his window, past the garden wall where the cat sat, past the small park where in summer, there were children at all hours, and in late autumn where I was now, there were only pigeons and the last of the bronze leaves on the horse chestnut trees. I thought on those mornings about a great many things. I thought about my mother's hands, which had known every stitch of every piece of fabric she had ever touched. I thought about the shop, which Cecily was managing with a competence that continued to surprise and please me, and which I had been returning to gradually, 2 days a week, then 3, feeling the familiar weight of the work settle back into my shoulders like something I had put down briefly and was picking back up. I thought about Renata's letters in the drawer. I thought about what it meant that she had written about the silk panel. I thought about Felix, who would arrive on Sunday at 2 o'clock, and who would have something urgent to tell me about either deep-sea creatures or lock mechanisms. On a Thursday morning in October, I sat down at the table by the window where I wrote my letters, and I took out a piece of my good paper, and I wrote back to Renata. Not a long letter. Not a door thrown open. A short letter. 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, I told her I had received all 3 of her letters and had read each one more than once. I told her that the silk panel she had described sounded remarkable, and that she should trust the instinct that had made her stop and hold it. In the second paragraph, I told her that I was not yet ready to see her, and that I did not know when I would be, and that I was not going to make a promise about something I could not promise. But I told her that Felix would continue to come on Sundays, and that what she chose to do with the work in front of her was the only thing I was watching now. I signed it with my name. Not Mother. Not Mom. My name, which is what I am, in full. I sealed it and posted it that afternoon on my morning walk, past the baker and the garden wall and the bronze leaves. Here is what I know at 69, with a repaired heart and 37 years of work behind me and a grandson who arrives on Sundays and a drawer with 3 letters in it. What we give our children is not a down payment on their future behavior. It is given and then it is gone, and if they spend it and squander it and reach into the cabinet while we are on the table, that is the account they have drawn down, not ours. We do not owe them the silence that comes from love. We owe them the honesty that comes from the same place. A woman who opens her eyes after surgery and finds the worst instead of the best does not have to pretend she did not see it. She can see it clearly, name it precisely, and act with the full authority of a person who built something and therefore knows what it is worth. The heart, repaired and returned to function, does not forget what it has loved. It simply becomes more careful about what it lets in. You cannot take from someone who is watching, and you cannot surprise someone who has spent 37 years paying attention, and you cannot outlast someone who got up at 5 in the morning for 4 decades and intends to continue getting up. My name is Dorothea Marsh. I am 69 years old. I came back from the table, and everything that needed deciding was decided before the anesthesia wore off, and what remains is mine, entirely and without apology, to give or to keep as I alone see fit.